million documents and interviews with more than 230 people found a, quote, pattern of incompetence and neglect inside GM.
Repeatedly, individuals failed to disclose critical pieces of information that could have fundamentally changed the lives of those impacted by the faulty ignition switch.
The investigation was called after faulty ignition switches were blamed for the deaths of at least 13 people. Victims' families interviewed before today's news conference were hoping for more of an explanation.
We know what happened. We want to know why it happened.
I need to know the facts of what killed my daughter and took my daughter's life.
None of these accidents needed to happen. They could have been avoided.
Back in April, Barra deflected numerous questions about the recall during congressional hearings, saying she was awaiting the outcome of the probe. Well, those answers didn't come today. Congressional documents showed GM noticed the ignition switches had problems as early as 2001, and that a fix would cost just 90 cents per switch when the cars were in production. And yet, the company waited a decade to issue a recall. As a result, federal regulators slapped GM with a record $35 million fine earlier this year. Today, Barra set August 1st as a deadline when she hopes the company will be ready to begin paying out claims for compensation to victims and their families. GM hired 9/11 Compensation Fund Chief Ken Feinberg to run the program. Feinberg said today, quote, "I'll be spending the next few days seeking advice and input from all interested parties as to the terms and conditions of that program." But as several federal investigations continue, there are bound to be more reactions like that of Connecticut Senator Richard Blumenthal, who said today, "It seems like the best report money can buy. It absolves upper management, denies deliberate wrongdoing, and dismisses corporate culpability." Lauren Fix is an automotive expert, and David Shephardson is the Washington bureau chief and automotive reporter with the Detroit News. And David, I'll start with you on the question of whether or not, just looking at this report, it is, as the governor of Connecticut said, does it come across as self-serving?
You know, I don't think that's true. It's very, very tough. It lays out a series of failures, from people not talking to one another to not changing the part numbers. I mean, a systemic series of problems over 10 years. Yes, there are some questions it doesn't answer, namely, why did these engineers not, make the fixes earlier? But it spares no criticism, and nobody looks good at GM, in the wake of this report.
And that was a senator of Connecticut, I meant, not the governor. And Lauren, let me ask you, as far as the families here are feeling that what they really want is a why, right? The answer to why they decided to wait 10 years. And just going through the what of it, is there a way, is there any sort of technological, any logical explanation why you wouldn't want to go ahead and do this 90-cent fix?
Well, I agree with you. There is no logical method, and standard engineering procedures, and I've worked in manufacturing most of my life, is when there's a product that does not meet the original blueprint and then is in production and there's a fault, you go back to that blueprint, you make a revision, you change the part number, and everywhere down the line knows about it. The fact that they didn't do it, and what really upset me is when Mary Barra was saying that the engineers didn't realize that when the ignition switch was in the off position that the airbags didn't function. To me, that is standard common sense in engineering. When a car is parked, essentially the ignition switch assumes it's parked, and a car gets hit, the airbag doesn't deploy. To me, that was the big factor there, and that is part we're going to read. When we read through those 300 pages that are part of this report, we'll get to know a little bit more details on what happened and why.
Well, I mean, then that begs the question, David, were they not testing these cars? I mean, I guess those of us out in the consumer world sort of, I guess, are trained to believe that periodically these companies do crash test, they do test the cars to make sure they're safe and that they're meeting federal regulations. Was it just a decade of no testing?
No, they did test the vehicles, and in fact, by the specifications of the part they designed, it would have been fine. But what happened was GM agreed to buy parts from its supplier that did not meet that specification. So you had some people at the company assuming that, hey, the car should operate properly because we've designed the switch the right way, and others, without others knowing, agreeing to buy substandard parts. And in fact, when the switch was finally improved almost 5 years later, even that switch still didn't meet the technical specifications. So you had a company where information wasn't shared, and they spent years and years, as the report says, looking for the root cause, holding meetings, but nobody ever really taking ownership to say we've got to fix the problem, and nobody high enough in management knowing we've got a number of fatalities and something has got to be done urgently. Even last last year, after almost 10 years. They still didn't take it very seriously, and it took, months more to finally get the recall done.
And so really quickly, just staying with you, David, who was let go, and what was the explanation for why they fired these particular people?
15 people, the 2 engineers most responsible for the day-to-day operations, of vice presidents, lawyers, and they were fired for 2 reasons: incompetence or wrongdoing. Either they didn't do their job or they simply looked the other way and didn't alert people when they should have.
Okay, let's listen to Mary Barra issuing an apology to the families of the victims who died in those at least more than a dozen crashes today. Let's listen.
I want to first take an opportunity to again express my deepest sympathy to the families that lost loved ones and to those who were injured. I realize there are no words of mine that can ease their grief or their pain. I want it known that we will face up to our mistakes and we will take them head on.
So, Lauren, this apology has been issued. There have been some firings. If you were representing those families or you were dealing with those families, what more do you think they would want to know?
Well, I think that Mary was very sincere in her apologies, and she truly does feel sorry. But I think as an attorney who would be defending, them, helping their clients, I would think that, you want to know why this happened, and if this was under the old GM and they were actually at fault, and there was proof of this, and this is something that will require, again, reading through the report, I would definitely try to lift the bankruptcy and try to get as much money as possible for my client. Any good attorney would do that. And even though they have a fund they're setting up, you have to look at those details, because I always say what the big print gives, the small print takes away. And it's entirely possible that if you sign on to this fund, that you may actually release your rights in order to go back and sue them again in the future if more information is disclosed.
And David, you heard Lauren talk about the old GM, because of course the new GM was heavily invested in by the American taxpayer, which is why basically every American sort of has an interest in what happens here. Is there any sort of factor that plays into the fact that GM was in part of times sort of in loco parentis to the taxpayers of the United States? Does that factor into this story at all?
It did not factor in so far as the senior management didn't know about the problem, didn't deal with it seriously because they didn't get reports. Certainly, there was a factor that in the run-up to GM's bankruptcy, they were running out of cash, they were cutting staff. The report says they didn't have as many safety engineers as they could have. It does not blame the cost cuts or the bankruptcy for failing to miss the problem, but rather this systemic, cultural problem at GM where no one wanted to accept responsibility. Things were done by PowerPoint. No one kept records of who went to meetings, and there was really a pass-the-buck mentality. That's why Mary Barra was so strong today in saying to employees, you have to speak up. You have to alert your superiors if you see anything about safety problems, because the whole future of this company, rests on it. This can't happen again.
Well, I mean, in terms of speaking up, this was also something that didn't come up when the United States was considering essentially bailing this company out. That people didn't speak up, including to the United States government that was about to bail them out and save the company.
Exactly. All that GM or all the Treasury got was basically a list of a dollar figure of liabilities they thought that GM faced. They never got any details on these issues because, frankly, it didn't get taken seriously by management. And the culture at GM was not to come forward to say this was a problem because it might have delayed the small car launch and it might have cost sales. So there were, people were. Sorry, go ahead.
No, go on.
Oh, and people were instructed at GM not to take notes during safety meetings. I mean, it was very much a culture of minimize liability, don't do things that could hurt the company. And, that's really why 10 years later, you had lawyers inside the company saying, we did basically nothing for almost a decade, and this is really going to come back to haunt us.
And final word from you, Lauren. What do you think, what do you make of the fact that this whole saga hasn't really cut into GM's bottom line in terms of car sales? Why do you think that is?
Well, if you look at May sales specifically, their sales were up 14%, and their fleets were up 21%. You got to remember, when it comes to the fleet, you're talking about municipalities and corporations, and if the government has anything to do with it, they obviously wanted General Motors to make contract deals with municipalities that are federal government and local municipalities, so a lot of cars are going to fleet. I think they make some really great product right now, and some people don't even realize that General Motors is also Chevrolet and Buick, but we also have to remember that because of that, People that love GM will always love GM. And some people that think of it as government motors will never come back. But they're starting to draw in more sales with their product. They have some exciting product.
All right, that'll do it. Thank you very much.